Hi, hello everyone. I'm so excited to be here. So my name is Hidde, and I am a front-end web developer, I've been in development for a while and specialized in web accessibility. And I'm really excited to be talking about that to you today as well. Yeah, it's going to be a bit about like how you can design with components, or like in a component-based world, as I like to call that. So that's what my talk is about today, accelerating your accessibility in a component-based world. But now I want to talk to you about web accessibility, and what's a better way to start that than to talk about what actually is web accessibility. So yeah, let's have a chat about that. Accessibility is to ensure that people with disabilities can use your website. It is that they can like buy your products, that they can come over and complete all of the steps that you have, that they can use your website, your service, all of that. And that applies to a lot of people that are going to be on your site. 1 in 5 of people in the planet, they have some sort of disability. You know, this is important. This is a large part of your audience. Yeah, if they are not on your website, it might be because your website isn't accessible. So bear that in mind. If you don't have these people on your site, yeah, that might be your site's problem. We've got to make sure that websites work for people with disabilities because they face barriers on the web. Even though the web is accessible by default, and there's lots of good accessibility on the web, there's lots of stuff that people with disabilities have trouble with, like transferring money or making a vaccine appointment or something like that. And we've got to smash those barriers. I think that's important. It doesn't make sense that someone wouldn't be able to do such simple tasks, and yeah, we've got to make sure that those sorts of things and everything else just work on the web. And we can do that by looking at accessibility standards, by looking at best practices, and by looking at user testing. So standards, they provide a really good baseline with like almost a checklist of things that your website needs to meet. I'm talking about guidelines like the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, for instance. Best practices, they are around because these guidelines can be difficult to interpret, or sometimes there are multiple ways to interpret, so best practices can help you figure out what to do basically. And then user testing is another aspect to make sure that what the guidelines say and what you are doing actually makes sense to end users. So let's talk about components. Yeah, as Nia mentioned, I started a while ago, and when I just started making websites, I usually was tasked to build web pages. So the designer would send me a Photoshop file, and in the Photoshop file there would be whole pages, and sometimes I would even be charging them by page. Like, I'm gonna build 5 pages, this is how much I'm going to charge you. So it was really like a page-based mindset, and that has really changed over time into a component-based mindset. Thanks to the work by people like Alec Matova and Brad Frost. These people have really revolutionized the way that we work, and not just as developers, but also as designers and as anyone who works on stuff for the web, even content folks. And everyone on the team kind of thinks about, we're gonna build this feature rather than this page. That's really helpful, and it allows us to reuse stuff. And if we can reuse stuff, we can also reuse accessibility, and that's really cool. One thing is important though, that we repeat accessible patterns and not inaccessible patterns. This gives us a responsibility basically, because you know, if we don't do our accessibility right, then we might end up repeating inaccessible patterns rather than accessible patterns. So if we do it well, that's great, because we'll be repeating accessible patterns. If we do it badly, we will be repeating inaccessible patterns. So whatever we do, we've got to make sure that accessibility is going well in what we're doing. The good news is you can do this using any framework because it's really about the markup, whether you're using Vue or Svelte or Eleventy, one of my favorites. It doesn't really matter what you use to output HTML to the browser. Ultimately, it is about what that HTML is, so what is inside of that HTML. Now, as you probably all know, DOM tree is what gets generated. So when someone goes to your website and press enter, they go to your URL, press enter, the server is going to respond with HTML, with markup, basically, and the browser is going to turn that into a tree in a systematic way, so figuring out what's what and maybe correct some mistakes there. This is actually, it sounds simple, but it's quite a complex complex thing to do. I can recommend the book Idiosyncrasies of the HTML Parser by Simon Peters, who goes into a lot of detail, and if you think it's trivial, check out that book and figure out what kind of decisions browsers make in this stage. It's hard to build a DOM tree, basically, if you are a browser. But what they also do, in addition to a DOM tree, is build an accessibility tree. And the accessibility tree is something to keep in mind because it contains lots of information that is relevant for users of assistive technologies, which maybe many of those users with disabilities. They may be using assistive tech to access your website. So assistive technologies are systems like a screen reader that can read out everything that happens on the screen in voice for people who cannot see the screen, or screen magnifiers, or voice control. Lots of different systems that need to know what's going on the screen in order to convey it to end users. And to figure this out, they look at platform APIs. These are APIs that exist on the platform and that are able to communicate kind of what's going on in the platform. So stuff like, I've got a Mac with a dock and they know what that dock is, or in the browser they might know this is the search bar and this is the favorites menu, all of that sort of thing. But whenever you go to a website, that website is brand new. You may have never seen that website, you may have never seen it. And then markup comes in that might be completely fresh markup. So how is it going to figure out what that website looks like? Well, that's where the accessibility tree comes in. It has all the information about the accessibility that's relevant. And as I mentioned before, it is based off the DOM tree, which is based off your markup. So this is why I repeat and repeat, it is the markup that matters. Learn HTML if you can. You may be learning lots of other interesting languages, but HTML is really the power tool of the web when it comes to web accessibility. If you get your HTML right, quite often your accessibility is doing quite well too. Alright, but I promised to talk about components, right? So what are some checks that we can do for components when we are building them? And this is based on, I do a lot of accessibility auditing work. So I'll go to a website and figure out kind of how it meets accessibility standards. And some checks for each component is a section that I've kind of built based on the reports that I've written. So these are things that I've seen a lot in the wild, and that I feel like if you know about them, they are not expensive to get right. They're not difficult to get right. You just need to know about them, and I'm here to tell you about them, right? So let's start with this one. An accessible component works without a mouse. Now this is important for lots of different people, like people who are blind and cannot use a mouse. You know, mouses, if you use a mouse, it requires eye-hand coordination, and many blind people don't have that for obvious reasons. People with low vision, they may have trouble tracking a pointer indicator across the screen. People with hand tremors, they might find it difficult to use a mouse and prefer a keyboard. So a lot of different people with disabilities, they need your interface to work without a mouse. And the way to test that is basically by figuring out if you can use the tab key to get to everything on the page that can be clicked. And that includes links, buttons, and lots of other controls too. That's important. Figure out if the tab key works. If you're on a Mac, you might have to turn on some settings in order for that to work in the first place. And another thing to check for is the active control highlighted. So here is a piece of my website, and you cannot see my mouse, you cannot see my keyboard, but you can see which link I'm currently at because there's a rectangle drawn around it while I'm going kind of moving across my page. You can see which one I'm on, and that's because I've defined a focus style. So use :focus in CSS and define something that makes it really clear what the current element is. So this gets applied to the element that you are on when you're using your tab key. And yeah, you can draw a rectangle. If you find that ugly, you can add rounded corners, you can do lots of things there, but make sure it's very clear so that someone without a mouse can see easily where they are. And then the last thing to look at when you're working without a mouse is whether the order makes sense. The specification, the standard says you need to ensure a logical usable source order, and that basically means you don't want to be jumping all the way across a page all the time. So you're in a header first, and then you go to the footer, and then you go back to the header, and then to the content, and back to the header. That's messy. You want it to be something that you would expect. So when you're using the tab key, what makes sense? Like, are you going from left to right, or maybe from top to bottom, and kind of figure out what your order is. If your page is going right to left oriented, maybe that's the other way around, but make sure that there is a sensible source order. Then the second point is that you want to make sure that components have sufficient contrast. That's important for people who have low vision or color blindness. They might find it difficult to read text that has low contrast. And it also applies additionally also to people who might not even have a disability but are in direct sunlight or have their brightness settings set to much lower, so they just can't see the screen very well. Another reason to look at this. Now you can check this using an automated contrast checker. For instance, in Firefox, if you use the accessibility tab element picker, it will show a tooltip over everything and it will show you what the contrast looks like. Same goes for Edge and other Chromium-based browsers. If you hover over some link, it's going to show you a pop-up with an accessibility section in there, and it's going to show you what the contrast is. It will show these letters, AA, and that basically means you're meeting AA level of, I think in Firefox, AA means that you're meeting AA level in WCAG, in the standard. In Edge, I think it just means text contrast, AA for text. But yeah, you're passing it, it's got a check mark, so that's great. If you have much lower contrast, it's going to point it out to you, so pay attention to that. You can also put it in your DevTools, in your CI/CD if you wanted to, so that you're testing it kind of while you're building. Another interesting website to check out color combinations is Who Can Use. You might use Can I Use quite a lot. Who Can Use is going to tell you about different kinds of color deficiencies that people might have. And whether your website is going to deal well with them. Then another aspect is that accessible components need to name all controls. That's really important for people, for instance, like Holly Duke, who is a blind girl. She's got this blog called Life of a Blind Girl, and she wrote about what she finds annoying when she's using the web as a blind person. And one of the things she mentions, one of the top things, is that unlabeled links make it harder for her to navigate a website easily, quickly, and independently. Now we've got to listen to Holly. This is important also for people with physical disabilities. They might be using voice recognition software. People who are blind and use screen readers. Not all blind people do, but some people do. So these people really need controls to have names. Now let's look at what that means. Say you're building a social network and you've got a text area that you need to put some text into, and there is a submit button at the bottom. Now the submit button, you might be coding in HTML with the button element, which is for buttons. And in the accessibility tree, if we look that up, it's going to have a row of button that comes with the button element for free. It also has an accessible name, which is null or empty string in some browsers. That's not great because this means it has no name, and Holly is not going to like this because he cannot know what this button is for. Is it going to delete my content? Is it going to submit it? Is it going to close the window? You don't know. Maybe it's going to print stuff. You don't really know what it's going to do. So what you can do is put some text content in there, and you will see in the accessibility tree that is now parsed as the button's text content. So that's one way to do that. Other ways are you can put an image inside and it's going to take the alternative text of the image. So if you have an alt attribute, that's going to be included in the accessible name. You could even have just an image, and then it's also going to take the alt text as the accessible name. So in this case, that's aeroplane, and then the accessible name will be aeroplane for the button. This is important also when you have a logo on your website that links to the homepage. Know that logo's alternative text will be the link text for the logo, so you might want to put useful things in there. You can also use ARIA label, or ARIA labeled by. That will also label your buttons in some other way. Now you want to make sure that all of your component has useful names for all of the links and the buttons. And if you have form fields, you can use the label element for that. So if they do, then it makes your website a whole lot easier to navigate. Now if you want to know all the nitty-gritty, you can look at what the algorithm is. It's defined in accessible name and description computation, but basically it's text, content, ARIA label, and then ARIA label by, so that's in order. If you want to find these links, I will be sharing them later, the blog post I mentioned earlier too. You can also look at what the name is in browser. For instance, if you're using Edge, it's going to show you a pop-up with accessibility that we saw before, and then there is a name and a role. In this case, the DuckDuckGo logo has a name of DuckDuckGo. That seems great, and then the role is link, which makes sense because you can click on it and you will navigate somewhere. So you can figure that out too, and this is something you might come across a lot because when you're using your DevTools, it's just going to show that. So yeah, pay attention to what everything's name is and make sure that it makes sense. That's how your test is. So you want to know, is there a name? What is the name? And then also, is it meaningful? Is it going to help? So usually you want function and not form, which means you want the button name to be send and not aeroplane. It might look like an aeroplane, but it is for sending. So you want to have the word send in there, and you want to keep it short. Then accessible components also allow for zoom, which is something that's used a lot by people with low vision. They might be zoomed in up to like 400% in the browser, which means they will see the interface like you would if you zoom in 400%. So basically the way to test that is to make sure that nothing breaks when you do that. So in this case I have a previous image and a next image link, and they overlap. This is annoying. I've just told you what the names of the links are, but if you didn't know, then it's really hard to see. And the way to fix it is basically to put that next image link lower, put it underneath or something. Maybe the designer won't like this, but at least this is accessible. People can see what this is for, and you can work with the design department to figure out, is there a way we could display both of these in a really big size. And you might be doing this anyway for mobile devices, because usually when you zoom in, you see the view that mobile users would see as well. Then states are also important. Accessible components would need to convey their states to assistive tag, and that's important for people who use assistive tag, like screen readers, like voice control. Often they use ARIA to understand the web page better. Now you can get a lot of that for free when you use standard HTML elements. So the state of, is this checkbox checked? Is this input disabled? Is this thing expanded? Is it hidden, invalid, pressed, selected? These all come for free with the HTML elements that are listed here. So input type equals checkbox. You can use a disabled attribute. If you're using a summary with details, that's going to have an expanded state. The hidden attribute type equals email. If you do that and someone types in something that's not an email, it will get the invalid state. If you press a button, that's going to have the press state when it needs to. And of course, when you have a select with options in there, the selected one will get that state of selected as well. You can also do all of these with ARIA. There are ARIA attributes that map to this, but usually you want to use HTML if you can. If you absolutely can't, then you can use ARIA to do it, but often you will also lack with a lot of other features that these native HTML elements have. They come with lots of things for free and that are sometimes hard to emulate with just ARIA. So ARIA is a second choice. Use HTML if you can. Now you can figure out what the state is by looking in the DevTools. For instance, in Firefox there is an accessibility tab. If you go to the element, like in this case I've selected broccoli, it shows up in my accessibility tree, and then there is a states thing that I can look at, and it's got the state of selected. It also has focusable and selectable, which is more of a property than a state, but yeah, that happens. Don't pay too much attention to that. The selected state is there, and that's what's important. Then accessible components also honor user preferences, which means if someone sets up their computer in a certain way, that actually works. For instance, people with low vision, they might use high contrast mode or forced color mode. Now, forced color modes or preferred color schemes, they are described in the CSS color adjustment module, and they include things like Windows high contrast mode. It is an example of that. People can turn that on and see the interface with contrast that works for them. Could be a lot more contrast than your website might have. In high contrast mode, a lot of stuff gets changed. This is a bunch of properties that will get changed when you use high contrast mode. They may get updated by the browser, like your color might be adjusted, your fill, your background color. All of these things might get changed by the browser. And many things will also get removed altogether. So like the box shadow or accent color, they might be gotten rid of by the browser by itself. So keep it in mind if you're building for high contrast mode that some of these properties may actually change, and that is per spec. So you can find that in the CSS specification too. It's also important when you're using a focus outline with a box shadow. If you're using box shadow to define your focus outline, and you're turning off the regular outline, make sure you set it to transparent and not none, because your box shadow is going to disappear in high contrast mode. I've had a QA engineer work with me that told me about this. I broke it, and yeah, this is how to fix it. If you're using SVGs, usually current color is really helpful, because high contrast mode will then usually use the right color. I've written a blog post about that. It goes into more detail too. If you want to read more about high contrast mode, there is an awesome blog post by Melanie Richards and Alison Mayer of Microsoft. So that's also linked in the slides that I'll be sharing later on. Then before I go, I want to tell you a little bit about the accessibility object model, which is a project conceived by a couple of browser makers, they want to figure out if they can add some things to the web platform that lets you as developers provide information to assistive tag APIs directly, so not using attributes but kind of directly in JavaScript, and also read that information, so basically read and write accessibility properties. It fills some gaps in ARIA. You can provide your own accessibility and you might be able to test even from JavaScript, which I think is quite exciting. You can do things like setting semantics without markup, so set a role with an IDL property, so you do element.role button, and then you've made it a button rather than using the role attribute in HTML. And this can be helpful when you're doing things like building web components, where you don't want your users to have to copy paste all of those attributes. You can build them in JavaScript. You can also set relationships without so-called ID refs, which means if you have a for attribute and an ID attribute that you link together, like with labels and input fields, you don't need to do that anymore, and that's really helpful in web components because those things can't travel over the shadow boundaries if you're used to using web components. And there's a lot of ARIA attributes that also need to use ID refs, and it would be easier to use them with AOM. Then there was some talk about events from assistive technologies, but there are lots of privacy concerns because we don't want ways to fingerprint or figure out if someone uses an assistive tag in the web platform, because we don't want people with disabilities to be singled out in statistics, or that's not great. These people deserve their privacy. And the same goes for non-DOM nodes in the accessibility tree. There are issues there. So yeah, that was meant to let you create your own accessibility tree even if there's no DOM to base it off, like when you're using Canvas. This might get solved with just ARIA because there are some issues too. This is very much in flux at the moment. And then there is a proposal for letting you read accessibility tree through JavaScript so that you can use it in your unit test and other places. So that might be really helpful if you want to know what something's state is. You don't need to go into your DevTools and check it out. You can actually read it in JavaScript, and yeah, you might want to do that in your tests. So I'm almost out of time. I want to give you a quick summary of what I've been talking about today, some of the main takeaways of today's talk. One is we forgot to build accessible components. In some places there's legal requirements, but generally, even if there's not, it just makes sense. You want these people to buy your products and use your services. Everyone, including people with disabilities. It's such a big group, and it applies to so many of us that, we've just got to do that. It is markup that matters. Markup is really important, and more important than your choice of framework when it comes to accessibility. You want to get your HTML right and hire for HTML expertise. Use standards, best practices, and user tests together. So just a standard probably won't cut it. You want to see if users can actually use it and figure out what best practices are. Then main things to consider: keyboard, contrast, names, zoom states, and user preferences. Sorry, zoom and states and user preferences. So yeah, look at these things, and I wish you a great journey in making all of your components a whole lot more accessible. And with that, I want to thank you very much for attending today's talk. I'm really excited about this. And yeah, thanks so much for having me. You can find me on Twitter at HDV if you have more questions, or you can find these slides on talks.hiddedevries.nl.
So, like in terms of accessibility, so this question has been asked by Pradeep. So, this procedure will it takes a lot of time, right? So, how can we prioritize the actions for accessibility? Where should something we should start from?
The first would be to actually say what doesn't take much more time. Like some of the things I mentioned, like color contrast, it doesn't cost more time to pick the right color. Like you're spending time picking your color anyway. Yeah, choosing the right colors doesn't necessarily take more time. I know of a Dutch bank called ING who have millions of customers. They have an orange logo which is on a white background. They've had their branding color changed because of these color requirements, and that worked for them. This was a multi-year project for them, right, to get that brand color change. Sometimes that's hard, but in general, yeah, a lot of these things are quite easy to fix. Like if you have some gray text on a light background, if you make it a little bit darker, that doesn't really cost a lot of time. And the same goes for a lot of these things. Like some of them are hard, especially more advanced ARIA practices. They can be quite difficult to use, but a lot of the basics, they are actually built into the web, and if you're aware of them, they are actually easy-ish to do. Yeah.
Is there any framework or something that, like, some template that supports the accessibility code from the start? Is there some library or something that we can use? Because especially like if you have already built a complete web application and then you're going to introduce accessibility into it, then it's going to be a complete makeover of the code. So is there a way to actually start at a point that allows already accessibility standards inside the code, some sort of a template or a library?
That's a really good question. One of the things I think about accessibility is the earlier that you do it, the easier and cheaper it is. So whenever you're able to do it at the start, that's a lot better. Like you say, it's hard to add it at the end. Thinking about things like the names for buttons, if you find that none of your buttons have names, then it's a lot of work to go in and change all of that. There are frameworks and libraries that claim they are accessible, and this is really important, I think, to really verify these claims, because there are a lot more that say they're accessible and not as many that actually are. That's really tricky about the accessibility world. Like, how do you know you've done it right? You sometimes need to get a professional audit done to make sure it's actually accessible. So be careful if a framework claims they are accessible. Take that with a pinch of salt, because that is not always true. Like, maybe use your tab key on their website and figure out if you can use it. If you can't, then maybe they are lying about the rest of their accessibility too. And I don't want to be cynic in here, like, people have good intentions and all of that, but it could be harmful for your end users and also for your bottom line if they are people who want to buy products in your web store or something like that.
Building on this, I do have one more question. Like you mentioned that a lot of these website or a lot of these frameworks and libraries, they claim to be accessible, but they're not. And you mentioned in your slides about not using ARIA elements. If you can use HTML, if you can, then definitely go for HTML. So what's the exact reasoning behind this?
That HTML is older, so it has wider support, is one of the things. So ARIA has hundreds, I think, of properties. Some of them are really well supported and some of them are not. So it's a bit of difficult thing to know for sure if it's going to work. When you use HTML, you can usually assume that it is well supported. And another is that HTML has a little bit more power sometimes. Like, if you use a button element in HTML, it doesn't just add the ARIA role of button. It also allows like keyboard accessibility, and it submits forms and all these sorts of things, which you don't get with ARIA. So there are sometimes things that are built into HTML elements that are not built in with the ARIA equivalent. So if you use ARIA, you usually need to take care of a lot of stuff yourself. Like, oh, this button needs to also work with keyboard, and you need to add some key handler and like figure that stuff out. Sometimes you even need to add it in the tab order, and lots of different things that you'll need to do that come for free with the HTML. So usually I'll recommend using the HTML element, because it has a lot of that stuff built in.
So Brisa wants to know if there are any tips for designers and developers to collaborate for accessibility effectively. I think this is a brilliant question. Over to you, Hidde.
I've been in a lot of teams where only one of them would be very accessibility focused and the other not. Like, I've seen that from both sides, where designers say we need to do this, and then the developers like, well, I don't care about that, and the other way around it also happens. So one way to make this better is to have someone higher up somehow who says we need to do accessibility, like the product owner or like the project manager just says so, and then everyone in the team kind of does it together. So kind of create a team spirit where everyone feels responsible for it, because it's hard for one developer or one designer to make the case if other people in the team are not so interested. And the other is like to sit together, maybe like I've done a lot with focus styles, for instance. If I add a focus style that's effective, like the 10 pixel black border, that's great for end users because they can always see where they are, but my designer counterpart might say, well, that's quite ugly. Can we make it prettier? Like, can we animate it? Can we add nice little shadows and rounded corners? Which we can, totally. So like working together on that is often really helpful, because you get kind of co-ownership of what you're shipping.
One of our fellow attendees wants to know a little bit more about ARIA elements. They want to get a more clear idea as to what these actually do and how they actually build into the surface. So maybe you want to comment on this.
Do you mean ARIA attributes in general, or some specific one?
No, not the specific one, just the ARIA system and how this has been.
Yeah, so ARIA, you could see that as a polyfill for accessibility onto HTML. So HTML existed first, and then people started building websites with that. But then we found out that a lot of features that people were building didn't exist in HTML. Think about something like tabs. There's nothing for tabs in HTML. There's no tab HTML element or something like that. Some work is happening around that, so maybe in a few years we will have that. Currently doesn't exist, so the ARIA folks came up with that and said, maybe we can define some of these things in a separate language, which was implemented as attributes. So you're adding attributes to your HTML to do that ARIA stuff. And another reason that it was done like that was that there were some really big corporates that had code that they couldn't touch the HTML, but they could add attributes. So for them, it just made sense to have that on a different level so that they can apply accessibility to their old HTML and that way make it a bit easier to use. So it kind of gives you an extra layer of accessibility. Yeah, it exists in attributes, but you can also see that it is applied if you're not using the attributes, but you're using HTML, like roles, for instance. There's a role and button in ARIA, but if you use the HTML button element, you can see that role also gets applied. So for browsers, it's also a way to communicate with each other about meta information for accessibility.
So what are the key things or what kind of hacks that you can share which teams can use to implement accessibility but faster?
That's a great question. So one way I think they could do that is by using reusable components, so that when they've done the effort on the component, that it actually gets reused properly, and baking it in some way. So not having something that you copy paste, but like you're actually using the component, so there's no way to use it inaccessibly, like kind of bulletproofing those. Something else I think is still priorities, and this is a bit of an elephant in the room, but there is usually a lot of time for experimenting with build tools or a new version of React. When that comes out, we have time to spend a couple of weeks to implement that. And then, oh, sorry, the accessibility, we don't have time for that. So it's also like, which toys do we want to play with as developers sometimes? I've seen this in real life situations where there wasn't time for accessibility, but there was time for things that may also be deprioritized in favor of accessibility. Especially if you look at how beneficial accessibility is as compared to things that may only benefit specific developers. Because accessibility could benefit the whole company, the customers of the company, and generally the whole world. So yeah, there's a good case to be made for accessibility if you can prioritize it. But yeah, if you want to make it a bit easier, components are helpful. Also CI/CD tools, they can automatically check your product for accessibility. Only 20% or so of accessibility requirements. So that's a small amount, but still it's nice to have that small amount automated so that you can focus on the rest. So I do recommend that. It can also be a bit tricky because sometimes they will find false positives and stuff like that, but still it can be very helpful to do that. And another strategy is to do it earlier, which Nia and I talked about too, right? If you do it much earlier, it is much easier and cheaper because you haven't built an inaccessible thing that you need to fix. It's already accessible, and that's helpful. So the earlier you can do it, the better.
Got it. Makes sense. So just one last question based following up on this question only, that what are these tools that people can use to make it easier to implement? Like one tool you told us about was this Firefox accessibility. I mean, can you share more about that, or maybe just more tools that you have in mind? Anything that this kind of people can take away, that if I'm going to start with accessibility, these are the tools that I will explore first.
Yeah, the Firefox accessibility tools are really good. Chrome has some accessibility tools as well. Chromium, so you can find those in Edge and in Chrome. There's also the Polypane browser. I know their founder is speaking at this event as well. It has a lot of accessibility tooling that you can run on your website, like stuff like, oh, can I figure out color schemes, or someone might have a specific kind of color blindness and you can preview your page like that, contrast loss, that sort of thing. So it has a lot of things built in. So I'd recommend that to Polypane browser for web developers.
All right, I do have one more tool to add to this. I'm not sure if this is actually something that you would use, but I found a tool called Wave, which flags it for warnings. So I think that is also a tool that users can look into for checking into access.
Yeah, it's nice. Yeah, it works really well.
All right. Awesome. Thank you so much for connecting today.
Thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure.